Hey, welcome to another episode of Innovation and Insights. I'm super excited to welcome Paul Ruppert. Paul is a seasoned executive in the CPaaS and mobile services. He has a mind blowing strategic consulting background and has also had two patents granted in the area of global text messaging. Paul is an expert in both public and private sectors, having generated over $400 million in direct sales. And currently, as the president of Global Point View Limited, Paul provides valuable insights to leading tech companies and prominent private equity firms. Very interestingly, just in the time before we started recording this podcast, we've spoken about numerous sports. I mean, ranging from golf to skiing to squash, name it, and we covered a whole lot of them. And a cool fact that Paul has is that he spent more than 25 years as a skiing coach. So today I'm excited to explore this area between strategy, between negotiation, and between skiing. So Paul, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Humang. It's been especially for the invitation to have a conversation about something that conflates sports, strategy, and business. That's not something that a lot of people follow. Usually, it's how sports are manifested in business, but very rarely how business can be utilized can be advanced by utilizing sports or sports strategies.
Yeah, agreed, Paul. I mean, and that's been a passion of mine. I think people relate very well to sports. I think it's a unifying factor, and I've worked on numerous innovation and strategic concepts. And you can quote things from, you know, seasoned books. You can quote things from Harvard Business Review case studies. But when you convey a sporting example, I think that hits the heart more often than not, and that's been my inspiration.
Yeah, I'm both a fan and try to be fairly active, more than fairly, very active in sports in a number of different activities that I like to pursue in my free time. And skiing's been a passion of mine literally from the time I was about 7 years old, which is the first time I was exposed to it. And then later was on a ski racing team when I was in middle school. And then luckily, as things work out, I was in a job as a lobbyist of all things. And my boss asked me one day, "Hey, you ski, right?" I'm like, "Yeah, I know how to ski. I'm pretty good at skiing." And he's like, "Well, we've got a board meeting out in Beaver Creek, Colorado, and I'd like you to come because I think you can contribute to the overall discussions of the direction of the trade association as you do here because I was a lobbyist for the trade association, but." The socialization aspects and the members of the board who I ski as well. I think you'll fit right in. I'm like, sure. And as a result of that, I decided, I think I should probably at least tweak things, go out skiing for a day or so at a local ski area near Washington, D.C., which is the biggest city that I live in. It's called Gaithersburg, Maryland, but it's essentially metropolitan Washington, D.C., near NIST, where you used to work, as we were talking about. And there's a place called Whitetail. It's not very big. It's only got about 900-foot vertical, which you can ski down in less than 4 minutes at speed. We used to joke, let's go do figure 11s, which means you just tuck and go straight down the hill, no turns. So, and, it's one of those things I go in and go into the chalet, and it was only 2 years old. And there was this little piece of paper, it was 8.5 by 11, and it says, interested in being an instructor. Whitetail is looking for strong skiers who communicate well to become instructors for the next season. This was like in 1993, 94, because I was pretty young back then. And I decided, what the heck? I think I'll do that. And it wasn't for that season, it was for the following season. And ironically, I go out to Colorado, and one of the board members' sons was a ski instructor out west. So I'm skiing with him most of the time. I'm like, hey, I got a question for you. I saw this flyer at this ski resort that I go to just coming before, it was like 2 weeks ago, and they're recruiting for ski instructors. You think I'm good enough to be a ski instructor? He was like, absolutely. You don't really need to be good to be a ski instructor. And he explained all of it, and that's how I got into becoming a ski instructor.
I wish I'd met you in Colorado. Well, my I've been there multiple times at conferences, and once we had this conference at the Keystone Resort,
Yeah.
in, and this was in the summertime, however. So it was all like mountain biking,
Yeah.
and on one of the off days we had, my professor and some of his friends are like, "Let's go downhill mountain biking." And I'm like, "Okay, but where?" He's like, "Okay, you go, you take your bike up these ski slopes.
Right.
You pick the easiest one, and the best part is this: the ski lift is taking your bike up, so you're not spending energy. All you're doing is braking on the way down." I'm like, I've never done this thing. Let's pick an easy slope. So they pick a slope which was called as the Girl Scouts Trail, and
Girl Scouts Trail. Okay. Right.
they listed that as the beginner slope. I must have fallen down 8, 10 times, scraped my hands, knees, because there's all sorts of rocks, there's tree
Yeah.
branches.
Dirt and
I don't
rocks
know.
can really injure you, while snow can really at least, absorb the pressure and the impact of the fall. Not always, but you can.
Yeah. So I ended up walking my bike down. And all the while I'm thinking that if biking down this trail is so difficult, I wonder, how skiing must be. Meaning it's so involved.
Right.
So as both as a skier and as an instructor, how do you negotiate these slopes?
So I always opened up my classes, and I've taught everything from 5-year-olds to 70-year-olds how to ski the first time. The 5-year-olds eventually got very adept fairly quickly, but I would always talk about, I'm here to take fear and anxiety and turn it into thrills and exhilaration and a lifelong passion for mountain sports. And we can do that in the 90 minutes we'll have together. And if you are, you have what's called never evers. They've never been on skis before. Um, my objective stating at the beginning of the lesson was always, I'm here in the 90 minutes. You're going to learn how to turn left, turn right, slow down, stop. And that's enough for you to have a great day on the mountain. You can stay on the bunny slopes, the beginners area, and that's all you'll really need. And if you want to do more, you might want to come back for another lesson this afternoon or tomorrow. So, here I am upselling already.
Yeah.
But you get the idea. So how do you approach that? Well, it's just like anything else, okay? You start at the basics, which is, here's this piece of technology, the piece of equipment that you're going to be utilizing. So boots, poles, skis, tips, tails, bindings. And then you start off moving, good instructors. It's not like, okay, get on your skis and let's go. It's, you do micro steps as to, you get into one ski and you start walking on that ski, walking on it, with one boot on the snow and one ski, one foot into the ski with your boots, etc. And you are gliding through. Then you can turn it into like a scooter where you push off with your boot foot and you slide forward in your ski foot. And then you do it on the other foot. And once you've done that, and there are other things, you start moving into making movements which are like pizza slices, which are wedges. Yeah. So you're essentially having them first in the boot, spreading that out, spreading the peanut butter, falling into all the tricks of the trade. Spreading out that snow and creating that angle to create that edge, to catch that edge. And you're doing on one, and then you do it again on the other, and then you do it together. And then you sidestep very small steps. A lot of people want to take huge steps. No, you don't need to, just micro steps. Now, what I've covered here in the last 3 minutes probably would have been the first 30 minutes of a 90-minute lesson. And then from there, you have, in many resorts, you have now carpets, sort of called magic carpets, which essentially is a conveyor belt that is rubber. It grabs the ski and moves them forward. And it's moving at a very slow pace. And once you get to the top of the hill or the run, which is not very steep at all, but steep enough, um, you are then stepping off and then getting in line. And then the instructor, what I would be doing from there is repeating the same thing that we did, but this time they're in full kit, meaning their boots are in their skis. Sometimes they would have their poles. With kids, I don't need poles. Poles are just
Right.
complicating. They don't need them either. And adults, then it's a matter of how do we, sometimes I would put the poles off to the side, knowing that I'm going to take them down and bring them up anyways. So it's not like somebody's going to steal a pile of ski poles. And so, you then get the orientation of what's called traversing,
Yeah.
sliding across the snow, left to right, right to left, perpendicular to what's called the fall line. A fall line is essentially if you take a ball, now we're talking physics, and you let the ball roll down the hill. Well, that's the gravitational pull against the angle of descent, the
Right.
steepness of the run. And so that's the fall line. And sometimes you might even have double fall lines where you've got going down, and then you also
Hmm.
have an angle going right or going left while you're going down. So these are all things you start to explain, and you move everything incrementally. And sometimes the largest class I've ever taught was about 16 people. Because on some
Hmm.
days like um, President's Day, 3-day weekends, and where I taught again at this place called Whitetail, that the cities that we drew from were Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Washington D.C., Baltimore. So those were all the areas where people would drive to. Might be 2 hours, might be 3 hours. For me, it was only 90 minutes from where I lived in Washington D.C. Again, nice, great area. It's now owned by Vail and Associates, but not really massively large. Or we're not talking about like skiing at Chamonix in France or the Alps or places like that. So that's how you would approach the breakdown of a class. And some people are going to take to it very quickly. Some you've got to help them along. There's various types of techniques. The one thing about becoming a ski instructor is you get certified, and certification, you join an organization called Professional Ski Instructors of America. You don't have to do that to be an instructor, but the reality is most resorts have this primarily for legal liability, because you've got to have training to be able to teach people how to do something, and that
Makes
training
sense.
is quite rigorous, because there are 3 levels. The first level, you have to have at least 40 hours of teaching. Okay. Now that's a lot, because you're only teaching for an hour and a half. And most people who might
Wow.
be at a resort might teach 3 times in a day at best. So it takes about 2 seasons to get to that level where you can go and take a certification course, which is run by other instructors. And they have a protocol, they have a process in terms of what you need to be able to know about teaching. It doesn't matter whether you're teaching squash or teaching
So
cricket,
any teaching.
any teaching. So you get teaching, educational theory as to here's how people learn, visual, physical, mental, all these things as to how we process when we learn, and then the various types of techniques, as well as you have to teach a certain style when you're an instructor. So you can watch how an instructor skis, and you can tell that they are following the processes and the rules set out by PSIA. And the rules are not the same globally, because you have different styles with the French, with the Japanese, with Austrians, etc. There are these different organizations that all roll into the same entity in terms of trying to teach with a uniform approach. They even have competitions, international competitions of ski instructors in teams teaching something and then demonstrating things. It's there's this underbelly of all this. I often joked that it was easier to become a radiologist technician than it was to become a ski instructor because there was so much to do. As I say, you have to know the knowledge, communicate the knowledge, and part of the knowledge is you've got to be able to watch someone ski and immediately, this is part of the exam. You have to be able to
Okay.
make the movement analysis and identify strengths, weaknesses, what exercises would you have them go through so that they can overcome and learn the process more effectively. And as I say, there are 3 levels. First level is level 1, fairly easy, fairly straightforward. And ironically, this is again, you've lived in the Washington, D.C. area, you'll understand this. Um, the people who were involved in being ski instructors was a wide range of individuals. I mean, I knew a guy who was a tractor, a what do you call, bulldozer operator,
Mhm.
from West Virginia. But I also knew 2 guys who were PhDs at the Department of Agriculture. I also knew an investment banker who was it. And at the time, I was working for a lobbyist. So you have this wide range of individuals who are involved in it. And some of us were really manifesting our type A mentality. So we decided we're going to get to a level 2 certification in 2 years. And we
Sure.
almost did, because when you go for your level 2, even in the level 1, you are graded and critiqued on your knowledge. So you have to take an exam, a physical exam, a mental exam, paper exam. And you also have to be able to teach a lesson and articulate what you're trying to convey in terms of the students' um, activities. But you also have to ski certain ways, and they test you on that. So they'll say, here's what I want you to do a demo, and we're going to do this over on the moguls over here. So he might say, I want you to take a slow as possible wedge turn, and we're going to go off on the moguls to do that. Now, what I've just said is a very, very slow wedge turn, a pizza pie
Yeah.
slice, if you will, in a very steep run that's full of bumps that might be 4 feet, 5 feet high, with lots of trenches and runs between them. And who even knows what the conditions are? The examiner instructors, they don't care. You got to go ski that a certain way. And if you don't pass. And in my case, I was able to pass the exam, I passed the teaching, but I didn't pass the skiing the first time I took it. So it took me 3 years to get to a level 2 certification. Level 3 is like people become professional ski instructors. And that wasn't, that would have taken maybe 5 years, 7 years or so. Although I do know a couple people who I still communicate with who became level 3s in their 50s. But they also became retired in their 40s. So
Sure. Now, what do these levels allow you to do? Meaning, does it allow you to teach people only for certain ranges of slopes? Meaning, is level 1 certification limiting you to
in a way,
more of a beginner level slopes?
yeah. So here's also how this works: is um, when you are set up and coming into what's called lineup, where people are lining up to go into a class. Before you've signed up to the class, people, the guy at the booth will be asked, or the girl at the booth, who are instructors, they'll ask you, tell me how you ski. Can you make left turns? Can you do stem Christies? Do you do parallel? Oh, you do parallel. Great. Do you do fast parallel? Tell me about that. And so they already know in their mind there are like 9 different levels of skiing that we use as part of the protocol. And so like level 1, level 2, level 3, sure, give that to a level 1, with different lengths of experience. So maybe a level 1 might have been a level 1 for 5 years, and they've done all kinds of different stuff. They've never wanted to do the level 2, but
Yeah.
they might probably be able to teach a level 4, level 5, level 6. You never know. And then the level 2s, they essentially can be just about anybody. Level 3 can do anybody. Even racing, even level 2, there's, becoming a racing coach is part of that process. And even in the context of, again, how this is an industry. And so they look at all the variables within the industry, and they want the instructors to be able to be adept at teaching children So children being 12 and younger, because that's essentially the seed corn for the industry going forward. As I
Right.
said, I got into it when I was about 6 and 7 years old, and then went from there. So you have a lot of instructors who've done a lot of work or become children's specialists. So yeah, there's different levels, and even within the level of instruction, there are different levels of additional certifications that can be had, much like accountants or doctors or
Yeah.
lawyers, etc. And it's an odd thing that it takes a lot of time and a lot of commitment, as do all things. But it also takes a lot of money because I used to joke, skiing is like the king's sport. Okay, the sport of kings. I think maybe horse
Yeah.
racing might be more expensive, but not much else beyond that. Especially today. I mean, it's like $100 a day for lift tickets, which was another incentive as to why I want to be an instructor. Once I found out that I'd be skiing when I wanted to ski after I taught, and then B, that the North American resorts, for example, give instructors discounts. So when I would go out west or something like that, it might cost you as a civilian $100 to ski, let's say, for the day at Aspen. For me, I'd show my card, my certification card, and my employee ID from Whitetail, and it would cost me $25. So
A good deal.
very good deal, which is why you have quote ski bums. That's the nature of the sport. So
But
that's kind of
Paul,
my skiing journey.
it's a fascinating journey, and I love the rigor in that sense because there's a responsibility, you know, to the skiing learner and the instructors. I mean, and the pipeline, because it's also a dangerous sport. I mean, people look at it for fun, but if you don't ski properly, the injuries are
Well, what's
fatal.
not dangerous? Let me put it that way. I'm not going to let you get away with that. There are many people who really love the danger of it because that's part of the exhilaration.
Yeah. Yeah, but you got to be trained in order to negotiate,
Yes. Yeah.
that well, and that's
Yeah.
why the onus on having a solid instructor is that much more important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll even go even further in my own personal background. My mentality when I first started, as I mentioned, I started off. My parents took me skiing. I have a sister who's older than I am, 12 years older. So she wanted to ski, so I came along with them. I'm the one who really loves skiing more than anything else. My mother is French, or was French, so she had already seen skiing in Europe. This is many many years before, and when I was like in elementary school, maybe in fifth and sixth grade, um, I lived near a shopping mall, and there was an anchor department store, and they had partnered with a local ski run. This was in Cleveland, Ohio. That was maybe 45 minutes away. So some very clever owner of the ski resort, uh, not really ski resort, but it's a ski run called Boston Mills, partnered with Hallie's, which was the department store at the time.
Hmm.
It was like Nordstrom's or something like that, and said, "Okay, I'll rent a bus, and you bring in kids between 7 and 12 or 7 and 13, and we'll take care of them for the whole day. We'll put them in classes. They'll learn how to ski. You will end up selling more ski sports equipment. I will get more, returns from people coming out to ski as a result of them going, meaning their parents will bring them out, their families will ski. So it's a win-win situation. I'm sure that was the conversation probably had by
Fantastic.
somebody, yeah, back then. And it was a great bloody idea. And back then, this is again for me, it was in the mid 70s. Skiing was very much an aspirational sport, so you had it was falling into the culture as to becoming much more widely accepted, widely pursued, lots of interest, television coverage of ski racing. You had the Olympics with Franz Klammer and Jean-Claude Killy, all these guys, beautiful, activities. I remember there was Some of it was sexist, but there was a boot company called Lang, Lange, and they had this great looking woman who was doing a high tips turn off of a mogul run, but of course she had a jumpsuit that was unzipped down to her navel. So you had that in terms of the advertising. So it was like, okay, this was really, it was starting to meet its stride, if you will. And so that was also part of that process, as I say, going forward.
So where I was like to now intersect with, let's say, the world of high stakes, which is, let's say, the financial world, or some of the consulting projects that you've had. A lot of it comes down to nailing the right strategy. And maybe if you can talk a bit more about how your skiing has helped, or how your skiing instruction has
Sure.
helped navigate people, because I assume you would have met people that want to ski faster than they can, and you've had to slow them down. And I'm sure you equally
Never.
you would have had people that want to close deals yesterday,
Yeah, that
and you're
was,
like, hey,
back
let's
to
go out
back to when I
together.
ask kids, I'm like, who likes to go fast? Okay, come with me. Let's go. Yeah, no, definitely. Let me redirect you from your comment in the context of the reality is that there's no one set strategy that's successful. It's really an iteration of strategies. Sure, you start off with a plan, and the plan is a reflection of the strategy. And how you implement the plan, the tactical elements feed into the plan, the tactics feed in from the plan feeds from the strategy. And that is really no different than once you start getting to the higher levels of skiing, and I'm not talking about like professional skiing, just even you are competent as a skier, you are looking at your run, or you should be, because there may be other skiers below you. I'll throw that out as my caution for safety. But the reality is, you're looking at the terrain and all the other different factors that are incorporated into that terrain. So factors as trees, factors as snow, factors as depth of snow, factors as when it snowed last, what's the temperature right now, how steep is it, is it groomed, is it not groomed, is it off piste, and all those things here, then you start looking even beyond the snow and raising your eye line, your horizon line, as to, oh gosh, it looks like there's snow coming. Okay. And even in the sense of, all right, what's been the weather the last, let's say, week? Because you might be in a virgin scenario where you are first establishing first track. So you're going down the mountain the first time for the morning. And let's say it snowed for like 3 feet last night, which I've been in places where 3 feet occurred overnight. In one case, three
Wow.
feet occurred like in 3 hours while I was on the hill. Uh, and so you then have to think, in that scenario, well, could this be an avalanche risk? And that requires you to know what the snowfall was prior to that. So my point being, in much like and very reflective of creating business strategies or even sports strategies, I think they come one and the same. Not just skiing, but let's say in cricket or squash, like we were talking about earlier, American football, etc. Um, the reality is that you have to ascertain and then ascertain the conditions that you're skiing in, but also back to your point, you may want to go too fast too soon. And can you manage that? And what's your risk envelope? What's your tolerance for risk? There may be a very high return in terms of a financial return in a business context. And the same way, there may be a very high return, which is the thrill context that you're trying to undertake and go off or do, or just trying to get down the hill as fast as you can because maybe the run is closing or whatever it might be. So these layers of analysis that are applied are extremely similar, um, in that context of being a skier, and as well as the context of being within a strategic context of whether it's innovation development or maybe financial engineering or just seeing an opportunity where you want to be able to go off and acquire a company, or seizing an opportunity where you want to sell a company for whatever that may be.
The part which I also like about the rigor you went through to become like a skiing instructor, at least in the certification levels, I don't think there's a parallel like that when it comes to the world of strategy. It's almost like you figure it out yourself. I wish there's something which guided you through these things, because what you
Yeah.
understand formally doesn't necessarily apply in the real world. Whereas your skiing instruction, that progression that allowed you to be on par with what you would face on the slopes.
Yeah.
Uh,
I will agree with you to a degree. And what you're essentially saying, there needs to be, it's whether it's for a cloak of security, um, some linearity in terms of the ability to apply strategy or learn strategy.
Correct.
I'm not sure that's really all that good an idea, because if everybody is going through, it's a very engineering approach. Forgive me if you're an engineer.
Yeah, I'm
I'm
one.
not an engineer. I've worked with engineers, had engineers work for me, but yeah, I'm thinking, okay, that is a very linear, logical approach to wanting to have, let's say, a package, a book of, using a skiing metaphor, a bag of tricks to apply to the scenario. But strategy is as much instinct and gut. I often, again, from my training in business, I talk about time, money, people, talent, and will, plus technology, are essentially the six factors of any initiative in terms of resource allocation, resource availability, whatever that resource might be. So that resource can be time, money, people is the number of people that you can get behind it in terms of supporting it, talent, the quality of the individuals that you're working with or as a group, time, money, people, talent, will. Will is a very amorphous amorphous entity, but it's really critical, because notwithstanding what we may think in the business press, startups getting to unicorns is not a pretty exercise. There's a lot of ruthlessness and just crushing activities that go on behind the scene. It's not, like I say, it's not as pure as the driven snow as we sometimes think it is. Um, and the other factor that applies to this is technology. Can you do something quicker? Another metaphor that I would be using in the strategic side is, sure, give me 40,000 slaves that are going to be working where they're growing grain next to a water source, and I too can build the pyramids. Okay. Or, if we want to build something to that scale, let's do the same kind of application where we've got indigenous farmers building a wall for a century, and you have the Great Wall of China. But if you want to become president in 6 months, it's going to take you a lot of money to be able to buy a lot of talent and a lot of advertising. So where's that money going to come from? Or if you want to do it in 6 years, or let's say Bill Clinton, in 16 years, you can use a lot of time, build up the number of people, grassroots support, different roles that you've had. All that plays out in the sense that strategy is not always linear, step by step by step. There's so many different factors to it that you've got to have that creative aspect to it. And if it's gut instinct, so be it. My father was a platoon officer in World War II in the U.S. Army. And at the time, he was a lawyer, so he was a little bit older than most. And I was born when he was not quite old, but he was 52 when I was born. And he would often talk about the differences in the success factors of the American Army versus the German Army. And one of them was the training, where the American Army was, even a private will be able to lead a platoon if lieutenant's not available or is KIA, killed in action, whatever it might be. While in the German Army, the only individuals were the officers, who had an understanding of, here's our objective, here are the techniques that we're going to go off, and instead it was ordered down to the German Army. That's differences in perspective in terms of the linearity approach or the command and control approach, as opposed to, okay, what do we do next? Let's try this, that kind of stuff.
So I want to pick on of the six factors that you said. I think a lot of them are measurable, except for probably will.
Yeah. Well,
And
there's one thing that can't be repeated, is not replicable. And what do you think that is of those six factors?
time.
You can't create it.
It's time, right?
Time, exactly.
Only resource that we
Exactly.
cannot create more of.
Yeah. So the bottom line is, don't waste time. That's what it all comes down to. And I have to say that that those six factors I learned from running political campaigns. I didn't learn that at Harvard Business School. So those were the things outside of the technology. That was one I threw in after I got into the technology world. I'm like, 5-factor analysis. Okay, no technology. Technology now needs to be part of the kit going forward. So.
But that's very interesting, because you could have like a short-term strategy, or you could have an ultra long-term, like the Bill Clinton example which you gave, which was a 16 years out strategy to execution.
Yeah.
But maybe a factor which also applied over there is will, because someone might be motivated today, but 6 months after that grind, their will might change.
The intangibles, again, this goes directly into sport of any sort, in the context of, there are some who are going to have this innate sense of competition, and they're either competing against themselves, or they're competing against another individual, or they're competing against an entity, another company, even in the context of sport. Well, I don't know Indian cricket at all, but I'm sure that there are probably rivalries, just as you and I were talking about earlier, from rivalries in American football between the Dallas Cowboys and the old Washington Redskins.
Yeah.
Okay. And even in the context of when I was in high school, we had a rival. I went to a public high school in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, called Rocky River High School, and our rivals were the Bay Village Rockets. We were right next to each other. And in most cases, whether it was cross country or football or soccer, which is what I played, oftentimes we would be playing against those rivals in different types of leagues, because we kept playing during the off season, indoor leagues, whatever. So we ended up knowing them as friends, but once we got onto the pitch, we were bloodthirsty enemies.
Yeah.
And that's why I say the will aspect of it, in the context of, no, we want to be number one, whether it's quiet will, which would be like founder of Apple, or much more manifested will, let's say like George Patton or something like that.
And how much of that, comes down to, communicating first to yourself that as a leader, this is what you may have to continually remind yourself that, hey, this is what we're after. But also how much of that needs to be conveyed to your team, because after a while they might be like, okay, you're on cloud nine, you're loony, we may not follow you, right? But that's what makes the big, hairy, audacious goals come to reality.
Yeah, there's also a trust factor in there relative to, are you a follower, whether you are a servant leader, whether you're a leader, a following leader, all these different types of leadership dynamics then start to flow into the equation and the consideration. And back to the pitch and sports, where is that manifested? Mostly in our cultures, all our cultures, whether you're playing cricket or where you're playing rugby or you're playing American football, it all comes down to that's trust factor, and then being able to manifest that leadership in that context, in that battle. There's a great line that you were getting really close to, but it was, I'm sure you've read Sun Tzu, which is the Chinese general who, on war, the bottom line, I think, the art of war, excuse me. Yeah. On war, I think, was Clausewitz, different Prussian. Sorry, but you get where I'm going. The context
Yeah.
of know thyself. Back to your context of knowing what you want and what your goals are. Know thy enemy. All right, what are our objectives? And guess what? Our rival, our adversary, our enemy has a vote in this conversation as well. That's the one thing about American politics I discovered, that most of the time they never thought about the other guy. They were always thinking about themselves. And even in business, oftentimes we don't really think about competitive dynamics on a one-to-one basis, but that does manifest itself. And then the last piece of Sun Tzu's parable was, do not fear 100 battles, meaning go for it. Just do it.
Okay. If you're driven, well, because his book is of, one day you read a page, you're like, okay, I think I know what he's trying to tell me, and the next day you're a bit like, did I understand that correctly? And allow me to explain, because he was a master at telling you, okay, at strategizing, and also at saying that the best war to fight is to not fight at all.
Oh yeah,
Avoid
or
as much as
yes,
possible.
right. Or the strongest weapon was intelligence. Yeah,
Yeah.
know thy enemy. Right.
Yeah. And but then also later on transform that, and it's sort of like this analog curve. It's not a binary thing. It's more of an analog thing, that you figure out, is this the time for me to go after my objective, take on my competitors, or figure out things in the back room where I can avoid the battle. But
Mhm.
there's a point at which things change, and you're like, okay, let's take this head on. Even if it takes 1,000 attempts, we are up for it.
Yeah, and on a geopolitical level, what we're talking about here is combat versus diplomacy, and
Yeah.
the ability to be able to blend the two. And that's what it comes down to. Oftentimes, I mean, everything that's going on in Israel right now is a conversation between combat and diplomacy.
Uh, Paul, you're such a well-read person. I'm also admiring the bookshelf which I'm seeing behind you. If someone wants to become a bit better, at least a better read person about strategy and how to carve a good mindset around it, what would you recommend as
Oh
books or
man, there's
resources?
so many. I mean, I've been reading this stuff for such a long time. That's why I say, um, I first read Sun Tzu when I was learning how to run political campaigns. Then I had two guys that were friends of mine in graduate school who were both West Point graduates, and the class that we were in was a marketing class, and we had readings from Sun Tzu. And they were like, "How do you know Sun Tzu?" I was like, "Well, I used to run political campaigns." Ah, okay. You know, there is a book called On Strategy that I can't remember, Japanese author. I could turn around and actually pull it off my shelf, but I don't want to get off camera. That's rude.
Sure.
But I'd be happy to,
I'll
why don't
look
we
it
do
up.
this? I'll send you a list of like 5 different books that I'd consider. I mean, I know that you also have an interest in innovation development.
Yes.
There's a number of books on innovation that I'd also recommend, because it's essentially the same thing relative to strategy. And that's why I say, is there one book that has stood out through all the years? Well, I probably quote Sun Tzu so frequently because the context is so applicable. That would definitely be one of the books that I would suggest. Um, there is Roger Porter's. I'll go more formal business education,
Mhm.
or Michael Porter.
Michael
Michael
Ford.
Porter he teaches a class at Harvard Business School called Strategy, and very dense academic tome, but a very famous tome in terms of how to be able to do and create commercial strategy. Um, that's probably what I, off the top of my head. It's not like I've been reading strategy books every other day. If anything, I can talk about espionage novels if you want to talk about that. It's usually what I read on planes. Um, there's a great one that I'm reading right now, but I'm not going to reference it. There are a lot of different things. Let me put together a list and we can include that.
No, we'll do, and I'll share that with as a part of the show notes so that others can
Yeah.
also enjoy and learn from these resources.
And if I
Because
may, I mentioned the fact that most of my career in the private sector has been in telecommunications, and probably about 95% of that has been focused on offshore international commercial activities. Um, that the point that I mentioned at the beginning on strategy, which is a Japanese book or the Book of Five Rings, both of those Japanese books. I think I read those in the 80s or 90s. But my point I'm leading up to is, you know, I like to be able to see strategy from different perspectives. So if there's anybody from your listenership that has some suggestions, let's say from an Indian context or a China, I lived in China for a little while in 2005. From a Chinese context, I mean, Sun Tzu will manage that, but you get the idea is to
yeah,
try to be as widespread in your reading as possible.
I fully agree. There's an interesting book. Just I have it in my bookshelf. It's called Reverse Innovation.
Yeah,
It's
I've had that book. In fact, yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a good one, which talks about this flip model of innovation instead of there's usually the waterfall model, which that we've come across. Like something is developing mostly in the Western world, let's say a business idea or a product, and then it waterfalls it down to other economies,
yeah,
and it gets adopted. This one is the other approach where the waterfall approach may not make sense for every area. I don't
exactly.
think that there's a better word for it, but I guess the fountain might be the best one, which is, it starts from the ground up and then makes its way up top.
Sure.
And we are seeing that a lot where I'm in India. The way the startups have evolved, particularly in the area of say mobile payments,
Yeah.
how e-commerce has changed. Uh, sure, the idea may have been inspired by other economies, but the execution and the scale at which it's happening here, I see a lot can move upstream
Oh
to
yeah.
the
I
Western
mean,
markets.
even in the sense of the business that I've been in, and I've been in the the messaging side of
Yeah,
telecommunications for the last 20 years. Very obscure, highly complicated to be able to send that text message from Bangalore to Birmingham, if you will, and then on to Birmingham, Alabama, if it wanted to be forwarded, within the context of, let's say, less than half a second. That's how fast these things are.
yeah,
To be able to do that on a technical basis is a very complicated exercise, even more so on a commercial basis, because what I just gave you was, let's say, Bharti was your supplier, your network operator in India. Let's say Vodafone was in Birmingham, and then Verizon was in Birmingham, Alabama. Well, there has to be three commercial agreements amongst those operators. And that was a job that I once had, being able to establish what I call those B2B contracts, the roaming agreements. And there too that reflects different types of commercial dynamics in terms of termination fees, which is like the postal service. If you put a stamp on a letter, send it out of Washington D.C., but it's going to Bangalore. The Indian Postal Service is promising the U.S. Postal Service will deliver that, so they move it along, and then they split the price of the postage stamp between the two of them, with the termination fee going to the Indian Postal Service. Well, there are individuals out there who set up these contracts and different termination fees for different countries for different reasons,
interesting.
or no termination fees in some cases, like in North America. Why? The whole story behind all of that. So my point here is that the layers of complexities become more and more manifested, not only on a technical basis, but on a commercial basis as well. And therefore, how do you approach the different strategies of engaging these
Yeah.
various entities that are 1,100 mobile network operators all around the world?
So when you work with these counterparts from different organizations across the world, across geographies, uh, you know, I can easily sense that your personality is being open to suggestions and feedback, and then modifying your message so that it also gets heard. apart from that, what has been like an approach that generally works well? Like, how do you always go in with an open mind? Because it's hard to practice that.
Yeah, I have a whiteboard off to my right over here, and it's got a whole bunch of different stuff that I've accumulated through the years that I haven't erased. And one of them is humility and agility. So being humbled um, that you're not the smartest guy in the room. There's always somebody smarter. And then the agile element is being able to adapt and adapt quickly. You know, as the motto of as many Marines will say, adapt or die. So the conditions change. And even the context, as you mentioned earlier, as I was talking about it, um, especially in India right now, there are a number of Indian companies that are acquiring other smaller messaging oriented companies called CPaaS, which stands for Communications Platforms as a Service, essentially the interlocutor between enterprises and customers to be able to create these messages that flow. And primarily, I raise this in the context of many of those are my clients, having been in that space for so many years. So back to the strategy piece, it's a matter of it's manifested and created differently for every region of the world, but also many times every country of the world is different. So the Indian messaging market is very different than the North American the North American messaging market, as is different from the European versus the UK market, etc. So you have to have that openness. That doesn't mean you are being a supplicant.
Sure.
You know, it's just a matter of having an understanding of, okay, things are done a little differently. How are we going to be able to match what we do with what they do, and how are we going to get them to match what they do with what we do? And then we get into another discussion relative to partnerships and the motivation and the strategy behind partnerships, et cetera. You know, strategic partnerships, vendor partnerships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's for another podcast.
Yeah. Now, Paul, this has been such an insightful conversation that I've truly enjoyed our discussion. I know we can go on many topics. I mean, you're just a fascinating encyclopedia also. So thanks so much for being open and by sharing all these details with us. I mean, it's been a great conversation with you.
Yeah, very satisfying on my end as well. Very gratified that you reached out to me to have the conversation. I hope your audience found it interesting and not too long-winded. It's been great experience being here.
No, thank you, Paul, and I look forward to having another discussion with you.